Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child psychology development course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in theories of development. Now this will kind of just be a broad overview of some of the predominant theories within developmental psychology, especially in the United States. There are many other theories that exist, but these are kind of like the foundational ones, again, especially from a Western point of view. A lot of this will be review if you've already taken a developmental course before, which is fine. The refreshers are always good. Even the PhD level scholars read the same thing multiple times to keep it fresh in their mind and apply it to kind of new scenarios. And also now we can kind of put everybody on equal grounds for those people who may have not taken a developmental course before. All right. So with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning on why theories matter, and let's begin and let's start off by giving a basic operational definition of theory, and developmental theory in particular. Organized explanations of child development that allow prediction of child behavior. Theories explain previous findings and predict future findings / form hypotheses. They shape the types of questions asked, the type of research conducted, and the interpretation of results. Most theories can never be, quote, proven, but the scientific process allows us to gather evidence that supports or opposes the truth of these ideas. Do not use the word prove in scientific writing, especially as an undergraduate student. Keep in mind, influential theorists in the field of child development developed their theories while living in a particular culture at a particular moment in history. Their ideas of child development reflect these broad socio-historical trends. We are all products of our environment. We often don't know what we don't know. So kind of just minor nomenclature. In general, kind of in daily conversation, we mix up hypothesis and theory, which is like fine for, informal conversation. But scientifically, theory has a particular definition that is different than hypotheses. Theories allow you to, again, kind of explain a collection of findings. So imagine, thousands, tens of thousands of results. Your theory or a theory should be able to explain those results, given the framework of the theory. And not only that, but predict future findings for research that hasn't been conducted yet, and it allows you to form new hypotheses based on the theory. So all those components are necessary for something to be called a theory. Not only that, theories kind of shape the types of questions that we ask and state the type of research conducted. So say, for example, there's a theory called the fetal programming kind of theory of development, which basically means, and we'll talk about it later on in class, but this is just an example, that prenatal development basically predicts or is at the root of all future kind of developmental outcomes, right? So kind of the idea here is thus the type of questions I'm going to ask in my research is, okay, how much stress did a mother or a father caregiver experience during pregnancy? Was there adequate nutrition in the household? Were any drugs taken? Something along those lines. And those questions are asked because, again, my theory argues that prenatal development is like the most important period of development. So again, I'm going to focus on questions that deal with prenatal development. I'm going to conduct research that analyzes pregnant mothers, maybe looks at stress levels during pregnancy. And based on whatever I find, I'm going to interpret the results given the framework of my theory. So I'm going to say, oh, a child has, a 7-year-old child has underdeveloped working memory. This is due because in the second trimester, XYZ happened. So again, you can see how the theory is kind of like all kind of encompassing. But it's important to note that theories cannot, quote unquote, be proven, especially in psychology. Most of the research you read is correlational in nature. That does not mean that it's worthless or bogus. However, you have to be kind of careful with your wording. Because different theories can interpret the same results in different ways. So thus, do not use the word prove when in your writing, especially as like an undergraduate wherein you haven't like read as much as like you're still kind of a rookie, kind of working through psychology. And then this historical trend kind of understanding. A lot of these theories, or all these theories, take place within a historical period of time, and within that historical period of time, there are social crises going around, there are economic crises going around, there are challenges within that subfield, and the theorists that emerge are kind of trying to address those challenges in the world and within kind of like psychology as a whole. So you have to keep in mind, so all these theories are taking place, are developed within a particular moment in history, kind of really reflecting kind of the demands and challenges of that moment. So let's jump into some specifics, beginning with the psychoanalytical theory. First European theory to describe stages of development through childhood. Biological urges move each person through a series of stages that shape the personality. Stage theorist. Freud theorized that personality is made up of three parts. That is the id, which is contains the basic instinctual drives. The ego, which is the ability to negotiate between the demands of basic drives in the real world. And the superego, which maintains the moral principles that work against the drive-motivated functioning of the id. Children have no conscious/internal sense of guilt until this is developed, Freud argued. So Freud is a stage theorist, if you remember from the previous chapter. Kind of the idea here is that at each stage you kind of unlock new abilities, and new challenges are kind of presented to you at particular stages of development, like that staircase example. And Freud basically argued that personality is made up of three parts. So kind of the idea with id is really just your basic drive. So hunger, and in Freud, spoiler, sexual. Everything. If you ever have a quiz question and you're like, what theorist thought sexual, blah, 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 it's going to be Freud. So it really focuses on these basic instinctual drives, in particular sexual drives. Ego, ability to negotiate between the demands of basic drives in the real world. So kind of the idea is, yes, the id has like unlimited demands of like food, what are sexual needs, and kind of the ego says, okay, listen, you can't eat 7,000 donuts today, instead eat 2 donuts. So kind of negotiating between the demands of your basic drive and kind of the real world consequences. It seeks out kind of ways to realistically satisfy those id drives, those basic drives. And then finally, the superego, which kind of can be conceptualized as kind of like maybe like internalized moral principles that exist. This works to kind of limit or kind of contain those id drives by a sense of like a conscious or like internal sense of guilt. And Freud basically argued that a child does not have that, and thus they're primarily driven by kind of like id drives. But eventually, you can look at this kind of example. If you think about id as wanting unlimited candy, you want it now, you want to eat unlimited candy. Ego saying, I'll have maybe 1 or 2 pieces of candy because if I eat too much candy, I'm going to get sick. And then finally, the superego is like, oh, good children, or like eat their vegetables, or I want to be just like my parents when I grow up, so I got to eat my vegetables, something along those lines. So kind of taking these moral principles, maybe these family-related principles, to influence behavior. The psychoanalytic theory argues that the unconscious mind, the part of our mind of which we are unaware, is kind of the primary driver of personality and development. Freud also argued that there are psychosexual stages. Freud's 5 stages in child and adolescent development, where sexual energy is invested in different parts of the body. Gratification of the urges associated with these areas of the body is particularly pleasurable. So again, development is occurring really at a subconscious level, stuff that you are not aware of, and those things, that's that unconscious part of your brain, whatever your personality, however broadly defined that is, emerges in kind of observable ways in the real world, but what's actually driving it is kind of this unconscious process that you're not aware of. And as stated, Freud's theory argues for 5 stages, all dealing with, again, sex-related energy, and kind of the idea here is that you progress through those staircases, and as you progress at each stair, your sexual energy, which is a primary driver of development, is directed to different parts of your body, which presents various challenges as you develop. So these are the 5 stages of psychosexual development, according to Freud, and kind of all of them deal with, again, directing sexual energy to different parts of the body, and all occurring kind of like at an unconscious level. Beginning with the oral stage, which occurs between birth to about 18 years of age. Freud argued that infants derive a great deal of satisfaction from activities that stimulate their mouth, lips, or tongue. Anal stage, ranging from 18 months to 3 years. The pleasure center moves to the anus, and issues of toilet training become central. Goal is to control body to meet society's expectations of behavior. Next, the phallic stage, ranging from 3 to 6 years of age. Sexual energy becomes focused on the genitals. Girls want to marry father, boys want to marry their mothers. However, the children have to get over that and identify with the parent of the same sex. Latency stage, 6 to 12 years of age. During this time, Freud argued that the sex drive goes underground. The sex drive provides energy for learning to take place, transfers interest from parents to peers. And then finally, the genital stage, which is 12 to adolescence. Sexual energy becomes focused on the genital area, and a more mature sexual interest develops between peers. So you can broadly see here how there's this kind of abstract notion of sexual energy that gets transferred to different parts of the body, and consequently is kind of like correlated with specific challenges. So for example, you have the toilet training issues, you have the classic Freud argument that girls want to marry their fathers, boys want to marry their mothers, boys want to kill their fathers, girls want to kill their mothers because they want to marry them or whatever, but then they have to like get over that and then identify with the parent of the same sex. So kind of like this gender kind of identification process, something along those lines. And then moving from like peer relationships, or removing from parental relationships to peer relationships. So kind of just basically all these kind of these developmental tasks that occur throughout the lifespan, or I should say throughout adolescence, from birth to adolescence, reflect kind of that sexual energy being abstractly moved around the body. And basically the argument is, kind of like all stage theorists, is that if you do not resolve all the kind of challenges presented within a particular stage, then yes, you can theoretically maybe move on to the next stage, but still there's basically going to be these unresolved conflicts that manifest themselves behaviorally as an adult, for example. So if you don't resolve the oral stage or something along those lines, maybe you're like a 30-year-old who still sucks their thumb because they never got over the like challenges that were they never successfully like resolved the challenges presented within that stage of development. So not only that, you can also see with Freud that development really stops at like adolescence. So he conceptualized it as like kind of birth to adolescence, and that's it, and it's all sexual in nature. Moving on to Erikson's social stages, psychosocial stages contain, within psychosocial stages, conflicts arise, rooted in the social experiences typical at that stage of development, and the way in which children resolve the conflict at each stage lays the groundwork for the next stage of their development. That is a mouthful. Unlike Freud, Erikson argued that development did not stop in adolescence and included 3 stages of adulthood. Issues of the ego are more important than those linked to id and instinctual drives. Development of identity is the central issue of children/adolescents. So Erikson is also a stage theorist, and like Freud, you kind of have to, there are basically different challenges that are present at each stage, and you have to resolve them in order to kind of like optimally develop. And kind of the idea here is that you don't always resolve them fully. Thus, even though you advance to the next stage, you're still kind of bringing with you that unresolved baggage from that previous stage, which then can manifest itself in behaviorally, so whatever, some kind of deviancy, whatever, drop out of high school early, teen pregnancy, have trouble keeping a job, relational issues, something along those lines. But unlike Freud, Erikson saw development continuing into adulthood. So development just didn't stop at adolescence, and that's who you are for the rest of your life. Instead, development continues on. And Erikson, kind of a much more positive dude about human nature, focused more on ego, kind of the regulation of our instinctual drives, rather than development being solely driven by kind of like id and instinctual drives, aka sexual drives. And the central theme of Erikson is not sexual like in Freud's, but kind of development of identity. For example, Erikson argued that infants have to establish trust in the world around them, so a developmental issue for infants is trust versus mistrust. Infants are totally dependent on adults. They expect their needs to be dependently and reliably met. When expectations are met, infants learn to trust the world and feel safe. If a caregiver is inconsistent, then infants develop a sense of mistrust. This impacts how they interact/form future social relationships. Each stage represents a different developmental context for new issues to arise. It's never fully good or bad, but rather like a seesaw. You're higher on one side than the other. So for Erikson's theory, this trust versus mistrust, this is just kind of just one stage or multiple stages. I'm not going to go through them all, but just kind of lay out this example. During this stage, infants, as we've talked about before, totally dependent on their parents or caregivers, just adults around them, the community, whoever it is that's taking care of them within that family and culture, and they expect those needs to be met reliably. There's something called like experience expectant development. This is not tested on, whatever, it's kind of a sidebar. But kind of the idea here is that developmentally, we all have universal expectations that exist universally across all humans. Like we expect a certain level of reciprocity with parents as an infant. We expect, shelter. We biologically kind of need them as kind of like a base wherein we can like de-stress ourselves as like a 5-year-old baby. We have to kind of, the world around us is stressful and we depend on our caregivers to kind of like take care of us, especially because humans develop for a very, very long time compared to kind of other species. So kind of the idea here is taking kind of that biological aspect. Erikson's arguing in this trust versus mistrust stage that when these expectations are met, that is like social expectations of whatever, some level of positive parenting, however that's defined within a particular culture, is met, and the infant feels safe, they feel secure, then that's kind of like a good foundation. Now you've learned to trust the world around you. You're able to trust in future social relationships. You basically have a template on what to expect from the world, developmentally speaking. However, if caregiving is inconsistent or just really negative, the infant can develop a sense of mistrust, and this is going to impact how they interact with people in the future. Because now they have the expectation that, all my relationships are going to be are undependable. Thus, I really can't depend on people, which is going to kind of impact how you interact and form new social relationships throughout your life. So you can also conceptualize this as like expectations of needings, kind of like trust and positive parenting, again, broadly defined. And what the infant does is kind of adapt based on those expectations being met or not met. So if it's met, then woo, we got positive relationships. However, if it's not met, on a biological level and a social level, the infant is going to adapt and say, okay, well, the world is not trustworthy. So that's how I'm going to socially and kind of biologically program myself, wire myself to meet the kind of the standards of the world around me. I now understand the world is harsh. I can't depend on anybody. Therefore, that is my kind of structure moving forward. As stated, each stage represents a different developmental issue, and kind of you have to resolve it or not resolve it, but it's really not either or. Again, you can think of this as like a seesaw or like a percentage, like how much of it have you resolved? And the degree to which you resolved it or not resolved it comes with you into your next stage of development, which can negatively or positively impact you resolving future conflicts that emerge throughout development. Modern applications of psychoanalytic theory. Though Freud's psychoanalytic theory has not been supported by much research, some of his ideas are still very influential, such as inner conflicts from earlier life experiences, especially trauma, form the basis for later psychological symptoms. The goal is to bring inner conflicts from unconscious mind into consciousness. Erikson's ideas have remained influential in how development is thought about today. The impact of context of development, social experience influential today. So briefly touching on this for Freud, really kind of the idea that early experiences matter, and even if they don't necessarily aren't remembered on some unconscious level, and you can maybe take this a little more actually like hard sciencey and maybe say like on a biological level, those early traumatic experiences can program or affect like your stress regulatory system, for example, or your inflammation system, which can like impact your immune system and thus make you susceptible for early death or something along those lines. And the point is to kind of identify those unconscious traumatic experiences and then bring them into consciousness and then deal with them in some way. Let's jump ahead to Watson and classical conditioning. John Watson is the father of the theory he called behavioralism, which concentrated on what could be seen, such as behavior, or what people do. He rejected psychoanalytic theory. It was developed in the context wherein the U.S. was trying to establish psychology as experimental science with observable phenomenon rather than unseen concepts of unconsciousness. Watson drew upon classical conditioning work done by Pavlov. Little Albert experiment, don't know for sure what happened, who the child was. So Watson, again, kind of rejected this idea of psychoanalytic theory at all. Either it's like complete nonsense, or listen, it may be real, but it's untestable, it's non-scientific, it's worthless. Like, get rid of it. So in his, so he's rejecting kind of psychoanalytic theory in the context of like psychology and kind of like broader U.S. trends of trying to establish psychology as kind of like a quote-unquote experimental science. So again, you can see kind of the impact of the historical era we're on, wherein now we're only going to look at behavior, especially for Watson, and a guy we'll talk about momentarily. We don't care about what's going on in the brain at all. We don't care at all about anything. Those may exist, it may not exist, but what we care about is, boom, what we can see, and that is all that matters. And one of the famous experiments is the little Albert experiment. I'm not going to go into detail about this. I included a video if you're interested in. It's kind of taught in general psychology. So if you're interested in kind of like theoretically developments of phobias or something along those lines, this was an experiment that Watson conducted to try and see if he can condition or teach a child a phobia about a rat. Some modern applications of classical conditioning, or more specifically kind of like Watson-oriented kind of stuff, is the use of virtual reality to treat children with anxiety disorders. You add a child in augmented reality wherein things that are scared of the, I should say, well said. So rewind. Add child in an augmented reality wherein things they are scared of are placed in the real environment. It attempts to resolve phobias. That is an unreasonable fear. So augmented reality is not like virtual reality where you just put on like this, whatever, the goggle looking things, like whatever PlayStation's is called. And then you're just in a whole different reality. Instead, what the augmented reality is kind of like, you're still in the present, you know, in your real world environment. However, you can place like, virtual reality, animals or creatures or whatever it is that you're scared of within your immediate environment. They have this in like Pokemon Go, so you can move your camera around and you're looking at your entire room as a normal room, and boom, there's a Pokemon in front of you, okay? But in this case here, say I'm very much scared of snakes, so I'm using some augmented reality device. I'm looking around and I see, boom, a digital snake, which looks like it's in the room in front of me, but it's actually not there. So kind of the idea with this is that you can place a person's in context wherein they're confronted with their phobia and hopefully interact with that phobia in ways that are healthy, and thus eventually through time, through interacting with the things they're scared of, that they have a phobia about, a snake in this hypothetical example, they can interact with that snake in a way that's like, oh, this didn't kill me, therefore this is an unreasonable fear. I'm gonna get over this because I'm interacting with the snake, there's no kind of negative repercussion, and I can continue on my life. You can also do this kind of with people with PTSD. There's some research trying to address this, or address kind of triggers of PTSD through augmented reality. Moving on to Skinner, who was alive from 1904 to 1990, so relatively recently, further developed the theory of behavioralism by introducing the idea of operant conditioning, where spontaneous behaviors are controlled by the environment's response to them. Reinforcement is defined as when a consequence strengthens a response or makes it more likely to occur. There are two types of reinforcement, positive and negative. Positive reinforcement is defined as an event that makes the behavior more probable. Giving a kid a new Fortnite skin, for example, after earning an A on their test to increase the likelihood of future A's. And negative reinforcement. Behavior is strengthened because something unpleasant is removed or is avoided after the behavior occurs. You can pick up a crying baby and the baby stops crying. It becomes more likely the parents will respond this way again in the future. All right, so Skinner's really interested in not just in observable behavior as Watson, but now we're kind of in this, okay, how can the environment manipulate behavior in ways that teach learning, or in this case he called it conditioning, and that is strengthening the response, strengthening a particular behavior that a person or whatever a society wants to occur more often. And this can be done, as stated, through positive or negative reinforcements. There's other ways, but we're just looking at reinforcement right now. And the idea of positive reinforcement is kind of like a positive correlation. We'll talk about correlations later on, but this is kind of just the order of the textbook. Kind of the idea here is that I'm going to give you something in order to increase the probability of a behavior occurring. So if I want you to do well or whatever, earn A's on all your quizzes, what I'll do is, as a parent or a friend or whatever, a professor, I will give you whatever, a McDonald's gift card or whatever, Starbucks gift card every single time you get an A. So the idea here is like, oh, I freaking love Starbucks. I'll do anything to get a Starbucks gift card. So therefore, I'm going to try to study, and then I'm going to get an A on my quiz. So I'm increasing the probability that you earn an A on the quiz by introducing and giving you something that you like. So by giving you that positive reinforcement, it increases the probability that the behavior that I want from you to occur, that is, you to earn A's. Now, negative reinforcement, very similar. In this case, though, I'm going to remove something from your environment or avoid some kind of behavior. So I'm trying to increase the probability of a behavior, something that I want from you, by taking away something or avoiding something. It's kind of like a negative correlation. One thing is positive, one thing is negative. So it can go in multiple different ways. So for example, say I want my child to shut up. Like they're running around, they're out of control, they're screaming, it's just like chaos, whatever. Okay? And say then I put them in timeout. Okay? Well, I want to increase the probability that they shut up, right? So what I can tell the child is, listen, I will remove the timeout punishment, or the timeout from your existence. There will be no more timeout if you stop crying. So in order to increase the crying, increase the likelihood that my kid is well behaved, increase the probability that my child is not screaming and running around, I'm going to remove that timeout. So I'm removing something to increase the probability of a desired behavior occurring. Or you can imagine like a dog and like a kennel or something along that line, and I'm doing like kennel training, and I say, all right, I want my dog to shut up and be calm before I let it out of the kennel. So to increase the probability that my dog calms down, I'm going to teach it through time that in order for them to leave the kennel, aka the kennel is removed from their life, they have to shut up and be quiet, be calm. So increase the probability of calm occurring by teaching them that if they do so, I'm going to remove them from the kennel, and then they are free and they can run around or whatever. But ultimately, in both types of reinforcements, you're trying to increase the probability of something occurring that can occur through giving you something or taking away something from you that maybe you didn't want, that's unpleasant to you. Shaping, bringing about a desired behavior by slowly reinforcing other behaviors that progressively get more and more like the goal behavior. You can't reinforce hanging out with friends if the child has no friends / never goes out. Continual reinforcement establishes a behavior, but less frequent reinforcement is more effective for maintaining a behavior. Casinos tried to exploit this by putting winnings on a, quote, random schedule, prolonged staying and gambling. So let's imagine a scenario wherein I want to increase a probability of a behavior to occur, but it's like I can't really get to that behavior that I want to occur without kind of taking a bunch of steps to get to that desired behavior. So for example, say I want my loser child to go out hanging with their friends. But that my child is like, hey, listen, I don't have any friends. So how the hell am I going to hang out with people? So, that's kind of a disconnect. So maybe you're like, okay, every time you go outside, I'll give you a Starbucks gift card. Or maybe every time you talk to a new stranger, I'll give you a Starbucks gift card. Or every single time that you talk to someone at your school and invite them over to the house or something along those lines. So basically what you're doing is you're reinforcing behavior that's progressively moving towards whatever desired behavior I have as an adult. That is, again, my child hanging out. So you can also see this with like dog training or any kind of animal training. You don't initially say, okay, dog, go do a backflip or whatever, roll over. What you do is, okay, the dog laid on its back. I'm going to give it a treat. Oh, the dog almost rolled a little bit. I'm going to give it a treat. Oh, it rolled even more. Give it a treat. So you're slowly shaping, bringing about progressively the behavior, whatever the goal behavior it is, through time, in either dogs or humans. And then finally, our final point here is continual reinforcement. And kind of the argument here is that continual reinforcement establishes behavior pretty quickly, But in order for that behavior to be maintained, it's better to randomly reinforce. So not reinforce every single time that you do a behavior, but whatever, once every 10 times or once every 20 minutes or something along those lines. And kind of the idea here is that the organism doesn't know when the reinforcement is coming, and theoretically they really want that reinforcement. So therefore they're going to be like, okay, it could happen this time, maybe. So therefore I'm going to try my hardest every single time to get an A. You can also see this as like kind of like casinos, wherein they'll try to design payouts that reinforce the likelihood of you continuing to gamble. So they calculate how often I need to pay you in order for you to keep playing, and then you're more likely to lose more money because they're a corporation. Most people lose money gambling. Some other modern applications besides gambling: applied behavioral analysis, ABA. It's used with children in schools and in disabled populations to increase certain behaviors and decrease other ones. It's accepted much more in the US than in other European countries, such as the UK. So kind of in the US, it's thought as like, oh, the gold standard for working with some disabled populations. However, that's debated across cultures. Bandura and social cognitive theory. Bandura proposed that we also learn through imitation. So this is the classic experiment. If you're not familiar with it, the Bobo doll experiment. Basically, experimenter or an adult punches a doll, and then the children who watch the adult punch the doll are more likely to punch the doll themselves. So kind of the idea here is that children maybe model their behavior based on their adults in their lives' behaviors. Social cognitive theory: all experiences that people have in their environments are filtered through the ways they think about them. And self-efficacy: core belief that one has the power to influence one's own functioning in life circumstances. Mexican television series was developed to address illiteracy, showing people struggling then succeeding at reading. So kind of maybe an idea of a social cognitive theory, wherein again we learn through kind of some imitation through adult figures, or maybe figures that we see in the real world that we admire for whatever reason. In this case, maybe a TV star. So in this circumstance, Mexico developed some TV series wherein the protagonist had some kind of struggle they had to go through, and then in the end they learned how to read. And then kind of the idea was, okay, can we design these programs these television shows to increase the probability that people will imitate this protagonist and they'll want to learn how to read, and thus we can decrease the levels of illiteracy within our country. Next, Piaget. Piaget argued that children construct their own understandings of the world based on experiences. He is also a stage theorist. Curious and active explorers experiment on the objects they encounter, that is infants, and watch what is going on around them. Children use what they know to solve problems and are able to revise understandings to better fit reality. It is an interactionist approach. It is an interaction between biological maturation and experience is responsible for children's cognitive development. So Piaget's big fundamental kind of base of argument is that children are naturally curious and active explorers. Thus, they will kind of go out on their own, whatever that means for like a 3-year-old, but whatever, actively explore in curious ways. They will encounter new objects and new social scenarios, which allows them to learn, watch what's going on around them, interact with things hands-on, and kind of confront new problems, which they have to work through or to resolve. So they'll try and resolve problems, and in the process, either they resolve them or don't, and if they don't, then they have to think, okay, why can't my problem resolution techniques work? Maybe there's a better, new way to understand the world that allows me to understand how to resolve these problems that I'm encountering. So through this process of active exploration, you encounter new challenges, which then you basically have to work through, and that is development. So thus kind of this biological maturation, which can be motor skills, but also kind of advance as you develop neurologically, and kind of active experience, hands-on experience, because you are naturally a curious, active explorer, that is responsible for cognitive development within a child. Piaget argued we are constantly learning about and adapting to our environment by organizing the world in ways we can understand. Schemas are units to organize understanding. They consist of a concept and all the associations to that concept that we have developed through our past experiences. Behaviorally appropriate for your age, gender norms. Assimilation, taking in new information and placing it into existing schemas. A creations of a new schema for new information. And We'll go with equilibration. You know, I was only in speech class until like high school. We're going to go with equilibration. Constant seesaw between assimilation and accommodation. All right, so let's work through this. We have this idea of and this can really be conceptualized as just a way of understanding the world around us. It's kind of like a model or a template that we use to quickly understand the world, and it tells us what to expect in certain scenarios. So, for example, gender norms. So, whatever, at like 5 years old, and say it's like 1960 or something along those lines, you're like, okay, boys play with trucks or army, whatever, and girls play with whatever existed in the 1960s. Barbies, I guess, probably still existed, and whatever other toys. So, kind of the idea is that you have this schema, this way of organizing the world, this mental shortcut, which can be useful at times, but also is going to reflect kind of like the social ways of understanding the world of your developmental context. So, in this case, gender norms are based on kind of our social expectations of how particular gender should act within a given historical period, or something like at your age. So we have an understanding of like, okay, maybe an 80-year-old person shouldn't be going like 90 miles per hour to a residential area. You're not acting like an adult. What are you doing? But not just that, but we have kind of schemas for basically the entire world. And we're constantly interacting with new things because we're an active explorer. And kind of the idea is that we have to adapt because we're going to interact with things that challenge our schemas. And we can adapt through kind of one of two ways. One is assimilation, that is taking in new information and placing it in an existing schema, or a combination, creation of a new schema. So for example, say I'm Christopher Columbus and I'm like, oh, the world is flat. And I'm sailing to do some horrible crimes against humanity towards the US. And along the way, I'm like, okay, whoa, I didn't fall off the edge of the world. Okay, so now my theory of the world being flat, it's kind of challenged right now. So I have kind of two options. I can either assimilate that information that the world is not, or I should say that I didn't fall off the edge of the world, and I can say, well, maybe the edge of the world is farther away, or somewhere else, or whatever, some kind of magical dragon saved me, and now I'm in whatever, the Caribbean, something along those lines. So basically the point is that I'm taking that new information and I'm placing it within my pre-existing schema, aka the world is flat. So I'm not really changing my schema. First is combination, which is a creation of a new schema. So say whatever, I've now made it to the Caribbean, ready to do crimes, but along the way I realized, oh, I didn't fall off the edge of the earth. Therefore, wait, the earth isn't flat. The world is not flat. So now I create a new schema of the shape of the earth that is theoretically more accurate. So I have basically two things. I can either jam that new information and warp it to fit within my old framework, my old schema, or I can kind of create a schema. And he basically also argued for this equilibration, and kind of the idea is that we're constantly bouncing back and forth between assimilation and combination, depending on what we encounter in the world. Because we have schemas for everything, we're encountering new information, and we have to, again, either take that information and fit it within our schema, or develop and create new schemas through a combination. Next, Vygotsky, sociocultural perspective. Cognitive development is shaped by sociocultural context, according to Vygotsky. It occurs and grows out of children's interactions with members of their cultures, and development is not universal. Cultural approaches in problem solving are passed down intergenerationally through oral and written communication. Education doesn't just teach facts. It shapes how we think about the world generally. Children internalize these modes of thinking and cultural values so they can engage with them independently in the future. Children are social beings who develop their interactions with wiser members of culture. So unlike Piaget, wherein we're kind of like this independent, active explorer, kind of just working really by ourselves, and kind of going through this accommodation and assimilation process, here Vygotsky is arguing for a much more kind of like a collective, community-oriented way of development. And in this case, children develop through kind of interactions and through guidance of all adults. They can be caregivers, parents, community members, whatever. And thus kind of your development will be shaped by your social cultural understanding, because as we talked about with socialization, you are taught not just kind of sets of facts, but really values about how to operate within the world. And the same thing is for education and school concepts. You just aren't taught facts, but teach you certain values, and it shapes the way that you understand the world. So kind of like schemas, how we have kind of shortcuts and frameworks of understanding of the world, those things shape how we interpret history and new challenges ahead of us. And these are culturally based, according to Vygotsky. And kind of the idea is that through time, children then internalize these values and these specific modes of thinking, which allows that child, as an adult eventually, to independently act on those values and engage in those modes of thinking. And thus, kind of culture is regenerated. But as I stated, culture is always kind of shifting, so it's regenerating within that new specific socio-cultural context. And Vygotsky classically, this is a big theorist, but classically within at least US kind of textbooks, are kind of often overlooked. You see Piaget for pages and pages, and then Vygotsky, you really get like half a page to a page. And there are a whole host of historical reasons why this is the case. Vygotsky was not from the US, he's from former Soviet Union, so there's kind of like translational issues that have occurred through time, but there's kind of a introduction to him, or really a new introduction to him as scholars kind of work through his scholarship and kind of translate that work. And also Piaget died very early, I think around whatever 35, 33, something along those lines, versus Piaget, who lived much longer. So this dude developed his theory at a very, very young age, and we didn't get to see kind of him progress in his intellectual thought process, unlike other theorists. Let's jump into some other specifics of Vygotsky's theories and kind of Vygotsky-like theories, but we're going to clump this in with like Vygotsky. Beginning with scaffolding, it's a learning mechanism in which parents provide initial assistance in children's learning, but gradually remove structure as children become more competent. The zone of proximal development, the gap between what a learner can accomplish independently and what he or she can accomplish with the guidance and encouragement of a more skilled partner. The zone represents the opportunity for growth that exists between a person's optimal ability and their actual performance on a given task in a particular context. There are skills within the zone, which is skills at which instruction should be aimed, and skills outside the zone, which is either well mastered or still too difficult. So as I stated, Vygotsky very much oriented his theory of development in kind of this collective way, and also kind of alluding to the argument that, well, the fact that mammals are a social species, thus humans are mammals, thus they are social species and are going to learn through kind of social interaction. And one way you can do this is through scaffolding, and this is kind of like related to kind of construction. So kind of the idea here is that you, as a adult, as a caregiver, a valuable member of society, a wise member of society, is teaching a younger child how to do something, and you're basically giving them a lot of assistance at first, but through time you remove that assistance, so again the child can eventually engage in that activity in an independent, competent way. You can almost think of this like as training wheels on a bicycle. So maybe give the most crazy training wheels and all this protective equipment, but through time you remove the training wheels, get them a big boy bike or whatever, and now they can ride a bike. But the important part is that this is being done in the process of a wise, older, knowledgeable, culturally and socially knowledgeable adult. This brings us to this zone of proximal development, and kind of the idea here is that there is a certain range of skills that can be developed independently, and there's kind of a range of skills and abilities that can be developed with the encouragement or the mentorship, the scaffolding of a more skilled, typically adult. So we kind of have independently, yeah, you can still learn a lot, but not as much as what you can with kind of the guidance of an encouragement of an adult, a caregiver, community member, mentor, whatever. And kind of the idea here is that between those two like poles, there is a zone. And kind of the idea here is on the one hand, on the far end, with encouragement from a skilled partner, you have optimal development. This is like peak your ability in a particular performance on a task. And on the other hand, you have, okay, this is what you can do by yourself. And kind of the goal is okay, well, you want to move that person towards optimal development. And you should target your instructions to target kind of that zone of development. So again, that gap between what you can do independently and with somebody else. So kind of the idea here is that you can imagine in this class here, I have a certain expectations of whatever a junior, sophomore, senior, undergraduate student is capable of writing, reading. I have certain expectations, and they're based on experience, my understanding of your capability, given kind of your age and expertise. So thus, I'm going to assign things that hopefully fall within that zone of development, so I can move you from, what you can learn independently to what theoretically someone who knows something, maybe debate, and bring you to more in line with your kind of optimal development. So I'm going to assign assignments that allow you to practice those skills that move you closer to your optimal development. So whatever, the project or whatever, these quizzes or something along those lines. But then we have these skills outside the zone, and this is either well mastered or still too difficult. So again, imagine in this class here, I'm trying to teach you child development. So say, okay, to do that, and say I'm foolishly trying to hone and develop your skills that are already outside the zone of development, that gap. Say, okay, I'm going to, in order to teach you developmental child psychology, I'm going to have you write your ABCs. Well, that one is not that really that relevant, but two, that is far too easy. You know your ABCs, that is well mastered. You can do that on your own. I should say at this point of your development, you can do that on your own. It's very well mastered. But I can go the other direction and say it's too difficult for your age. So say, okay, by the end of the semester, I want you to publish in a journal article in a peer-reviewed journal, and I want you to have 5 of those publications. Like, that's like not realistic. It is outside. It's too difficult given your current developmental state or developmental period, or given kind of your skills at this moment. And you can even do this with like a child, say like a preschooler. Say I'm foolishly trying to teach them skills outside their zone, but I want them to learn math. So I'm like, okay, kid, here's what you're gonna do. You're 7 years old and I want to teach you math. Go do trigonometry. Well, the kid can't do that. It's outside. That skill is outside their zone of development. And you can go the other way, say they're 7 years old, and I'm like, all right, let's learn how to count to 10. Well, hopefully, in general, they can do that by then. So that's outside the zone because it's too easy. So again, the goal here is to move you from skills that you can develop independently to your optimal development with whatever guidance from a mentor, and target skills that are within your zone of proximal development. Some modern applications of Vygotsky's theories is that no single test or score can adequately reflect the range of a person's knowledge. Development consists of moving toward the upper range of the zone, so as stated, moving towards optimal development, and no single test or score can reflect a person's knowledge because knowledge is kind of socially, culturally based, and there's not going to be just like one test that's like, oh, this is the knowledge of all people across all cultures, across all historical periods, because knowledge and modes of thinking are going to kind of be culturally based. Dynamic assessment, an approach for assessing a child's understanding of a concept where the instructor starts with the most indirect help and increases the level of directions as needed. Instead of testing what a child knows or can do at one particular time, the instructor asks a question to assess the children's understanding of the concept. When a child answers incorrectly, the instructor starts with the most indirect help. If this indirect help is not enough, the adult will increase the level of direction, potentially explaining the correct answer. So in this case here, instead of kind of like true-false questions or something along those lines, you're having a child think through kind of a question, a concept, and think it through and whatever, verbalize it or write it out. And kind of the idea here is that as an assessor or a teacher, a parent, or a mentor, whatever, initially allows the person to kind of talk it through this concept, talk through the question, and see if they how far they get. And then the idea is that the mentor will listen to the child's response and say, okay, I'm going to, or whatever, the child's not doing well on this particular part, so therefore I'm going to give them more help. And kind of, so I'm going to start with little help or indirect help through time, increase my level of help, aka my level of scaffolding, with the idea that I'm going to help you learn and think through this concept in more complete ways, and then eventually through time you will internalize that, and then boom, scaffolding, wonderful circle of life. Information processing. It breaks down the way we understand and use information into specific aspects of cognition, such as attention and memory. Piaget and Vygotsky gave a global concept about cognition in its development. However, information processing is a gradual, incremental developmental theory. There's kind of two concepts we'll talk about related to this theory. First, the Storrs model. It's based on the view of the mind as functioning similar to a computer. Cognition goes from paying attention to something to processing it and then storing it in memory for later use and retrieval. The assumption of this linear process is debated. There's also a cognitive or a connectionist or neural network model. Cognition consists of multiple parallel processes occurring at the same time. The brain functions consist of neurons or nerve cells. Instead of a step-by-step approach, the brain is operating through multiple simultaneous connections with other neurons. This is more contemporarily accepted. So kind of the idea of this theory is that, okay, Vygotsky gave these kind of global conceptual understandings of development. Here we want to get into the nuts and bolts of this situation here. How can we break down development through specific parts of cognition, such as attention and memory? And again, beginning with the Storrs model approach, this is really kind of an idea of like the brain as a computer, which has largely been rejected through time. But kind of the first, one of the first models, kind of the idea here is that you pay attention to something, you're thinking it through, you're processing it, and then it's stored in your memory, which then you can later retrieve and use. Thus, kind of you're learning things in real time, and development is consisting of like this computer process where, again, pay attention to something, we process it, and then we memorize it, and which we can then access later on. Versus this neural network model, wherein our shit ton of neurons that exist in our brain are kind of interacting with each other in very like dynamic ways. It's not this step 1, 2, 3 step-by-step process, but rather like billions of neurons, trillions of connections interacting with each other simultaneously to kind of influence our cognitive and biological development. And this can be affected by interacting with the world around us in an active way, like Piaget said, or through Vygotsky's kind of way of scaffolding and mentorship kind of thing. So this is really kind of like the biological process, the cognitive process, kind of underlying these other more global theories of development. And I want to briefly touch on this schematic that I included, or this figure. Information processing, you can think of memory as a neural network consisting of concept nodes interconnected by links. For example, you see a white duck. One node can represent a specific concept, such as the color of the duck being white. One can represent a higher order concept, such as duck. One can represent a superordinate concept, such as bird, depending on how many neurons are activated. Nodes are like neurons, and links are connections between individual neurons. When you learn something new, nodes form. So kind of the idea here is we see a duck, and a duck is well, I should say a duck is a concept. So within duck, we understand that there are different types of ducks. We understand that ducks are an animal. We understand that there are certain features of the ducks. It contains feathers, web feet, whatever. And we understand that ducks eat certain food. They worms or whatever the hell ducks eat. So the idea here is that this concept, duck, is neurologically connected to these other pieces of information. So when we think of duck, we can also access all this other linked information that that kind of gives more information about the broader duck, about the concept duck. And kind of the idea here is that as you learn, new nodes forms, that is new kind of concepts form. So whatever, you learn of the existence of a duck, you learn the existence of a cockatiel or a great white shark, which then creates a concept, and then you develop new kind of neural connections between that concept, that new animal that you learned, and whatever features of the animal, the type of the animal, where it lives, its habitat, its food, whatever. So it's kind of this neurological connection approach to how development works. This is underpinning Piaget's theory. This is underpinning Piaget's theory, or whatever other theory that you believe or you argue on behalf of. Some modern applications, developmental cognitive neuroscience. So this is a field within development wherein you're kind of combining development, neuroscience, and cognition. It's linking cognitive processes with changes in both the structure and the function of the brain and the nervous system through the use of modern medical imaging technologies, and is age-related. So for example, say I'm engaging in some kind of Vygotsky scaffolding process. I can examine or whatever, use fMRI technology to look at a child's brain prior to scaffolding, and then look at the child's brain after scaffolding and see, oh, what functionally changed out of the brain? Is there new kind of neurological connections? Are there new nodes? Are there new links? Did the brain change in some way structurally? Was the process stressful? Or was there a lot of like stress hormones now going around that person's biological system? So you kind of, again, linking development to these kind of cognitive and neurological and biological processes. And it also deals with age. So now, like, we have an understanding that, again, you can go back to zone zone of proximal development and kind of skills that are outside the zone of development. So we understand, again, that a 6-year-old cannot learn trigonometry in general because their brain is literally different than a 30-year-old. You don't have kind of the cognitive capacity, you don't have the neurological capacity, you don't have the experience that allows theoretically a 30-year-old to do trigonometry. A 6-year-old cannot do that. And this kind of neuroimaging technology can kind of give support of that by examining differences in brains between children, like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and a 30-year-old. Evolutionary theory, etiology. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is based on the idea that living things that adapt to their environment, not necessarily the ones that are the biggest or strongest, are more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. Etiology is the study of the adaptive value of animal and human behavior in the natural environment. Imprinting. Automatic behavior where ducks and geese immediately follow their mothers after they were born. This is adaptive because mothers provide offspring with food/protection from predators. The young ducks would otherwise die without this imprinting. It's similar to attachment, but different. We'll discuss this later. So kind of the larger global point here of this theory as applied to developmental psychology is that adaptation occurs, which we've talked about throughout this class, especially among humans who are extremely adapted to their environment. And adaptive does not mean necessarily positive or negative. Joining a gang can be adaptive because it's like, oh, now I have some social support and I can survive. It doesn't mean it's the greatest, most positive adaptation, but it is an adaptation. And kind of the idea here is that, obviously, classic Darwin stuff, is that it's not necessarily the biggest or the strongest, but the organisms that can adapt best to their environment are the ones who are most likely to pass on their genes to future generations. And one example within the non-human animal kingdom would be imprinting, wherein this is a classic example. If you see the duck, a newborn duck, and they start immediately running after their parents, they imprint on them. And you can also see when newborn ducks are separated from their duck parent, and then they imprint on like a human, and then they follow humans around. And this is considered adaptive because otherwise you're going to get eaten by like an alligator or something along those lines. So this process of imprinting allowed for geese to not just, or ducks, whatever, to just not be mass killed by predators and theoretically pass on the genes of imprinting to future generations because it was adaptive in nature. Next, Bronfenbrenner, he argued that scientists were studying human development out of context. Development can vary widely depending on the neighborhood, home, environment, culture, and other areas. He charged that developmental psychology has become the study of, quote, the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. People are embedded in a series of environmental systems, Bronfenbrenner argued, and these systems interact with each other and the individual over time to influence development. Changes arise from ongoing transactions or interactions in which a changing organism and a changing environment affect one another. So Bronfenbrenner is saying, okay, we have to study human development within a context because humans develop within their environment, and thus developmental outcomes will kind of reflect those environments. And you can even take this further with like adaptations, like you are adapting to your environment, which again could be negative or positive. So he's critiquing kind of the idea of like you come into a lab in this very like hermetically sealed kind of area, and then do some kind of sets of tests for a very brief period of time, and then come to big global conclusions. He's saying, is this really like applicable to the real world? Because we develop and adapt within the world around us. Within our environments. So you're kind of removing us and placing us in kind of like contexts that are really outside of our developmental context. So thus, what are these results really actually telling us about people's everyday real world behaviors? And he separated the environment into different kind of systems, which we'll walk through momentarily. And kind of the idea is that these systems, these environmental factors, interact with each other, and humans also interact with these systems. So the environment obviously impacts us, but we can also theoretically change our environments. Like new cultures arise, new political systems that arise, new economic systems arise. All kinds of things have changed, whatever, within the thousands of years of human history. So our environments affect us, and we affect our environment. And this theory is referred to as ecological theory. There are other names for it, but this is fine for this class. It contains this idea of ecological validity, which is the idea that research findings should generalize to the real-world settings. Development is conceptualized as a function of the interaction between the developing organism, as I stated, and the enduring environments or contexts in which we live our lives. And all aspects of the environment affects the individual, and the individual affects all aspects of the environment. We cannot understand the developmental life course of a person without understanding how the person interacts with all the different facets of their environment. All aspects of the environment affect the individual, and the individual affects aspects of the environment. So beginning with this ecological validity argument, kind of the idea here, as I was saying before, you put, when you're testing participants on whatever psychological construct, they come into the lab in this very controlled, hermetically sealed setting, and then we come to conclusions about psychology based on those tests that we administer within that research setting. And then the goal is obviously is to generalize those findings. That is, with the findings that we find in that lab, say, okay, well, this also applies to the real world. And then the question is, okay, well, does it? And thus this idea of ecological validity. So how ecologically valid are your research findings or your experimental setup? And I have one real world example of this. So for example, that marshmallow task, that's the classic marshmallow task where you put a marshmallow in front of a child, you see how long they can delay eating the marshmallow, and then that informs how strong that tells you how strong their delay of gratification is, right? And kind of the idea here is you're supposed to let the child do it themselves and not really interfere, and because it's their own independent delay of gratification ability. But what I kept finding when I was working with women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and children was that the adults kept kind of helping out the children, and it was like, dude, we just need the child to like do this independently. But then the question that I raised in my writings was, okay, that is kind of true that we kind of theoretically, I guess, need the child to do it independently so we can gauge their quote-unquote individual delay of gratification ability. But is that actually like relevant to the real world? Like in a collectivist culture, again, broadly stated, there's a lot of differences. How often are people really acting on this individual way without guidance from other community members, especially as a child? How often are they independently seeking delay of gratification outside the context of maybe a guardian? And we don't know. So maybe there's different ways to design that experiment of delay of gratification. Maybe there's a collective delay of gratification. I don't know. But those questions, the point is that ecological validity question raises concerns and challenges results that we find. It doesn't mean the results are like all bad or whatever, but it's something you have to think through. Now let's walk through the different systems according to Profenbrenner, beginning with the microsystem. Face-to-face interactions that a person has in her immediate setting, such as a home, school, or friendship groups. So this is kind of classic psychology, developmental psychology, especially in the US, really kind of that family-oriented approach to developmental psychology, wherein we're going to examine, okay, parent-child interactions, sibling interactions, stuff like that, household, just overall. So very much focused on that kind of immediate social interactions, which are really kind of emphasized, like especially in kind of Western psychology. Mesosystem brings together two settings that contain the child, parent-teacher conference. So kind of the idea here is that the parent is traditionally like not at the school, unless they work there, obviously. So thus they really only interact with the child within their house setting, broadly speaking. However, we have this other setting, this school setting that exists, and we're going to bring those two developmental contexts together. So the school and the parents come together, for example, in a parent-teacher conference, and now you're grounded. The exosystem consists of settings that the child never enters, that is, ones that are external to the child, but it affects the child's development nonetheless. Child rarely / never go to parent's workplace, but a parent's job will impact a child's developmental outcomes. So the exosystem, for example, could be a workplace, local government, maybe a neighborhood, but kind of the idea here is that the child is really not interacting with those environmental factors, those contexts that are present within the exosystem. So, for example, the parent's job. The child in general are not going to work with the child every single day. However, that environmental context could still impact a child's development because it's impacting their parent. So imagine a parent having an awful day at work or whatever. They hate their job and are super stressed out and are just like, oh my God, I'm tired of this shit. And now I have to come home and take care of my kid. I'm super stressed out. So maybe I'm not engaging in like reciprocal parenting. I'm not engaging in sensitive parenting. I'm not providing scaffolding, whatever, because I'm super stressed out. So kind of indirectly, those systems impact the child through the traditionally kind of like parents. Or at kind of a local government level, maybe there's like some new tax or something, or a new social program that either gives the parents some kind of amount of social welfare, which then allows the child to have more resources at their home. So again, the child is never in local government. They ain't voting within your city council, but indirectly it impacts your parent who engages with the local government more hands-on, whatever, voting, or maybe they attend some kind of meetings or something. But ultimately, indirectly, that impacts the child, and thus their development, because it's impacting the social interactions of their parents, of their community members interacting with the child. Next, the macro system. It consists of cultural norms, laws, ideology, social class, subcultures, values, embedded within institutions that underline our activities in our institutions that make up someone's everyday life. These are structures. They can be understood as a box within which they contains probabilities of exposures to specific environmental factors and behavioral outcomes. How does living in a particular culture impact, quote, individual developmental outcomes? How does living within a particular economic system impact, quote, individualized or individual developmental outcomes, such as values that are socialized? How does a law impact developmental outcomes? So this is much more large. This is what I mean when I refer to macro level kind of events. So this could be, again, all these different things: culture, political systems at like a countrywide level, your customs, your cultural norms, your laws, your ideologies, all these kind of these broad social programs, whatever, all these welfare programs, wars, stuff like that, and even kind of like natural disasters, things that impact like entire populations. These things all impact development. These are structures. When I talk about structures, these are kind of structure. We all live within structure. We all have, the country has a particular economic system. The country has a particular a political system, and that is kind of structure, and we all live within that structure, and thus are going to interact with kind of like values and laws and ideologies that reflect said structures. So another example could be something like colonialism. You can imagine that as a structure, right? A way of that individuals within that country have to live based on colonial law, based on colonial institutions. Those institutions will have certain values within them, certain norms within them, certain ways of viewing the world that are going to kind of trickle down and shape and increase the probability of certain developmental outcomes emerging. You can also maybe see this with like gender or something. So say women are banned from universities, whatever. It's 1910, you're legally banned from universities. Okay, well, how's that law? That law is going to impact you developmentally. It's going to impact the kind of jobs you have access to. It's going to impact your social resources, your economic resources. It's also going to interact how people treat you. You know, they're going to be like, maybe it's like you're interacting with someone. There's maybe that subconscious understanding. Okay, well, this law exists that excludes women from universities. There has to be a reason for that, right? And one relevant, one easily accessible reason is like, oh, maybe women just are dumb. They cannot be at the university level. Therefore, I'm going to interact with you in more kind of negative ways, which then impacts your social development. It's going to shape gender norms and just kind of our understandings of ways to operate in the world. It's going to impact our expectations. And women themselves are going to adapt to the environment, maybe internalize those misogynistic views, etc. So you can see, again, structure impacting, kind of trickling down and impacting our understandings of ourselves, the world around us, our context, and increase the probability of certain behaviors occurring. And you can also see this like racial exclusion laws, etc. And then finally, the chronos system, which consists of events that take place at different times in a child's life, as well as a time in history in which the child lives. This can include macro or family events. So divorce at 4 years old versus divorce at 40 years old, grew up in a historical era where gay marriage is illegal, grew up in a historical era of mass repression. So kind of the idea here is that kind of two concepts. One, when an event takes place in a child's life matters. So maybe there's differences and developmental outcomes associated with experiencing divorce when you're 4 years old, and your parents get divorced when you're 4 years old, versus your parents get a divorce when you're 40 years old. Maybe there's developmental differences. It's the same event, but because at the moment of time that you're at developmentally, that may impact your developmental outcomes associated with divorce, but also the historical period that you live in. So for example, going back to that, like you lose a job and say it's 1900, your parents lose a job. Well, guess what? You're probably screwed, especially if they're kind of just like working class, trying to get by kind of people, because there is no unemployment, there's no social security, there's no food stamps, there's nothing. You lose your job, you are in deep trouble. So thus, job stress associated with job loss, or just job loss in general, can lead and increase the probability of certain developmental outcomes in a given historical period. Because in 1900, you have no social welfare programs, and the year 2023, frankly, not that great, but you have a little bit more. So thus, that existence of new institutions wrapped up in the new macro systems given within a given historical period are going to impact your developmental outcomes. And this is kind of a lot of information, a lot of factors. It is impossible for any single study to take all this into account, but rather kind of the idea is kind of expand our understanding of development, understand that it's not just these one-to-one family kind of things, but rather these larger structures that impact us. Not just us, quote unquote, individually, whatever that means, if all these environmental factors are impacting us, but they also impact our parents, which then impact us because it impacts our social relationships between our parents and us, or whatever, our caregivers and us. So just keep that in mind moving forward, how like public policy, whatever, certain political systems, social or certain social norms impact development, not just your immediate household. And finally, dynamic systems theory. All different aspects of development interact and affect each other over time, with each part adjusting to other parts as the child seeks solutions for developmental problems that arise. Development is like an adaptive improvisation rather than a script. Child creates patterns of behavior as a result. For example, a baby who learns how to walk on a smooth, slippery floor may develop a different way to crawl than one who learns on a deep carpet. Development of motor skills are flexible. They are not absolute. Dynamic systems theories consist of characteristics of the whole child, such as the nervous system, the musculoskeletal system, child's motivation, in the context of the environment, together with the nature of the task itself when examining development or planning an intervention. So kind of the big takeaway here is that, as I stated before, you don't just magically become a new person at whatever stage or like a new age or whatever age. You're bringing with you your past developmental history, which consists of various developmental outcomes, kind of based on, whatever your theoretical persuasion is, but kind of a series of kind of adaptations that form kind of your development, and thus kind of fitting within your environment. Thus, development isn't this exact kind of script that every single person learns and develops in the exact same way. Now, there are still broad kind of outlines. We're all in general, universally, learn how to eat independently. We all learn how to kind of move or walk or crawl, something along those lines. Again, broadly stated. However, the context in which we learn and how we learn can differ. So, for example, learning how to walk on a tile floor where everything's kind of smooth, and if you fall, ow, I hurt my leg, versus maybe learning to walk on a nice deep carpet that you fall and it doesn't hurt you. Thus, your kind of developmental trajectory and how you learn to walk is going to be a little different within those contexts, which then may impact later kind of development, such as maybe your willingness to interact with people socially, or maybe some other kind of motor skills. But kind of the idea here is that adaptation, development is a series of adaptations that build on each other and impact future developmental outcomes. So one developmental outcome predicts a future developmental outcome. So thus, when examining the child, their current kind of stage of development, or how well developed they are given their age, it's important to keep in mind, according to this theory, kind of not just kind of the child's behavior that you're visibly seeing, but rather their child's motivation, their capabilities given whatever their stage of or their skill set of development, but also their nervous system, and in the case of walking, their musculoskeletal system. We must examine all these kind of components together in order to get a more full understanding of the child's development. Historical and cultural context. As stated, theories reflect the culture and time of history in which the theorists lived. Most theories were developed by European or US American theorists and based on research with middle-class families in the West, or I should say, at least most of the theories that we are taught. Erickson argued that autonomy was critical to development. Yet, broadly stated, in Africa, the overarching theory of development positions the child not in his or her, quote, individual self-determination, but as a socially integrated member of a human community. Thus, children are seen primarily as participants in cultural communities rather than autonomous individuals defined by their own interests. So again, cultures matter. Historical periods matter. Those macro system things matter because they kind of inform a population of kind of like what is appropriate developmentally. What are our values? What are our ways of seeing the world, thinking about the world? How do we view literally humanity? And how do we kind of socialize future generations? And what are we socializing them? And many, as stated, many theories, especially the ones that we focus on, are really very much focused on this individual, quote unquote, individual argument of development, wherein maybe there's some family influence, but really kind of that's it. But we understand now that macro systems, these larger contexts matter, historical contexts matter, cultural cultures matter. Thus, maybe trying to take like Erickson's argument verbatim that autonomy, all that matters, really isn't going to be that applicable to maybe some collectivist cultures, because again, that's not what that is not how they socially organize themselves. And thus, why this class will look at kind of under-researched, traditionally disenfranchised groups in our readings and throughout these lectures. Okay, with that said, thank you so much for everyone listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.